win that happened in Venezuela, a operation that was one of the most sophisticated and well-run military and law enforcement operations that I think I've ever seen, was because of very good espionage. This operation could never have happened without real-time, on-the-ground intelligence. So the intelligence that was gathered was not just where Maduro would be, but the CIA had a source that was close to Maduro that was feeding them information. Well, military operations across the entire world in different points at the same time are difficult because we only have so much military. So, for example, there is critical unrest in Iran. And there are some who are thinking that perhaps the U.S. could be planning a strike in Iran.
This is an India Today Global exclusive. I'm being joined by Eric O'Neill. He is a cybersecurity expert, but also a legendary FBI operative, known to have uncovered and exposed a Russian mole, Robert Hanssen. This happened in the year 2001. There's a book about it, a movie too. You can read and watch all about Eric O'Neill. But today we're talking about Venezuela. We're talking about Iran. We're talking about Trump administration's operations and how they're going. Eric, thank you so much for joining us here.
Ita, thank you for having me on the program.
Let's begin with Venezuela. One, it could not have happened without certain operatives on the ground, not boots, but operatives. How do you think it really worked? Because it took a long few months for them to put this entire operation together. What's your reading?
That's entirely correct. And the win that happened in Venezuela, a operation that was one of the most sophisticated and well-run military and law enforcement operations that I think I've ever seen, was because of very good espionage. It began with a first phase, which deployed U.S. CIA intelligence operatives into Venezuela, which is a hostile country. We don't have a diplomacy there. And so these intelligence officers had to go in without any diplomatic cover. If they had been caught, they would have been arrested and jailed, and learn what we call a pattern of life on Nicolás Maduro, the president of Venezuela, who the U.S., by example, has never recognized as the legitimate president. And that pattern of life meant they knew exactly where Maduro would be at any given time, what he liked to do, where all of his different homes and safe houses were, and most importantly, after months of learning about him, where he would be precisely the night that the military escorted FBI agents into the Venezuelan interior to serve a warrant on Maduro and arrest him. So none of this could have happened unless the CIA had learned exactly where Maduro would be and when, so the operation could go off flawlessly without a hitch.
Well, Eric, in your experience as an FBI operative, in your experience being in the U.S. administration, we've seen a lot of operations in the past, but none where a country and a sitting president, whether he's recognized or not, has been captured and taken out of the country. What did you make of this? The entire play of going into a country, picking up the president and taking him out.
Now, it's not completely unique. What is unique about this case is the sophistication and the overwhelming success. If you look back in history, the most comparable act like this was in 1989 when the U.S. went into Panama and removed Noriega, who was then the military leader of Panama. This was far less bloody in comparison, and the U.S. didn't maintain a presence in Venezuela like they did in Panama. But it is very unique in that we have not seen this very often in history, and it does set the stage and create quite a lot of concern, and that might be design for other dictators of countries who are adverse to U.S. interests, that this could happen to them.
Well, okay. In terms of operatives, in terms of the operation that you're talking about, and very sophisticated at that, how much of intel or how much of the entire operation depended on intel? intel from the ground, intel that was collected through communication devices, intelligence through other countries? How much of this entire operation depended on intelligence?
This operation could never have happened without real time, on the ground intelligence. So the intelligence that was gathered was not just where Maduro would be, but the CIA had a source that was close to Maduro that was feeding them information. They were using surveillance drones. They were using cyber espionage. And I am almost 100% certain that when the invasion of Venezuela to allow helicopters to move into the interior happened, that was the military strike, about 120 planes who led bombing runs at military installations. That actually began with a cyber attack that turned the lights out in Caracas and denied the Venezuelan military their early warning systems, radar and other systems, that those planes were coming. So the military in Venezuela, the secret police surrounding Maduro were caught completely off guard and totally blind to the fact that this was happening until special forces and FBI agents showed up at Maduro's door at a safe house he ran to and arrested him. So yes, you are completely right. It was all intelligence that allowed this to happen.
Well, that brings me to a very important point that you were making about the operations itself. Apart from the intelligence that you really require, you would have required, and it has to be an insider's job, you would have required support from the ground, and not to do with your own agency, spies, or people, but Maduro's inside circle. How important was it to breach that circle?
I think it would be very difficult to pull this off had there not been a source who was providing information from within that circle, or at least very close to Maduro. It's hard to keep track of someone in a hostile country. That person would have had to give them some information and intel on his movements, where he liked to go, where his homes were. And so certainly that penetration of the inner circle, what we call a mole or a trusted insider, was critical to the success of this operation.
Okay. Again, in your experience, and we'll come back a bit to Venezuela, but in your experience, the kind of operations that are being carried out right now, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Iran for that matter, what's happening in Israel and Palestine, the engagements in West Asia, or for that matter, containment of China, do you think Trump administration has outplayed its hand, or is way more stretched than it should be? Because we're not focusing on one country or one region. These are regions and parts of the world that America is engaged in.
Well, military operations across the entire world in different points at the same time are difficult because we only have so much military. So, for example, there is critical unrest in Iran. And there are some who are thinking that perhaps the US could be planning a strike in Iran. That could be difficult considering that many of our surface warfare ships are blockading Venezuela. So do you move them all the way back to the Middle East, or do you leave them there in the Caribbean? That those would be decisions that would have to be made. Of course, we do have long-range sortie bombers. It just depends on the military action that could be planned. Now, that's not saying that there's any plan in Iran. Sometimes an action like what happened in Venezuela creates a deterrence effect on other countries who might not want to tangle with the U.S. military, and can help benefit negotiations and pushing toward peace in other ways. And I think that is the central precept of what the Trump administration is calling their new peace through strength policy. If it works, it means that you don't have to use that force because of fear that that force could be deployed.
Well, this is also a real balancing act when it comes to announcing and achieving policy objectives as opposed to preserving tactical security, Eric. How do you look at this risk versus reward situation?
Well, there is a balancing act because if you do present the threat of strength, and that strength is sitting in the Caribbean and you need it in the Middle East, that makes it a bit more risky. But the proof will be in how this plays out, particularly, I think, in South America, in South and Central America, where there is currently a focus of preserving the United States dominance in the Western Hemisphere. So, removing Nicolás Maduro sends a signal to other presidents of countries in South America. It sends a signal to Mexico. And the proof will be in the next weeks and months in what happens in that area of the world.
Okay. How far does the role of the FBI really stretch when it comes to beyond American borders and onto the world stage? And how does that coordination work with the CIA?
Well, the FBI's mandate is to protect the homeland here in the United States. The primary focus is domestic, from foreign threats and internal threats. When I was in the FBI, my job was counterintelligence and counterterrorism, which is catching spies and catching terrorists. That is still a major mandate of the FBI. But in order to protect the homeland, you often have to look abroad. In the case of what happened in Venezuela, the FBI is the law enforcement arm of the Department of Justice. And the operation, although primarily it appeared military, was essentially a Department of Justice operation to arrest what the indictment against Nicolás Maduro alleged, that Nicolás Maduro was a narco-trafficker and had violated U.S. and international law. So this was a major operation to bring FBI agents into Venezuela, serve a warrant on Nicolás Maduro and his wife, arrest both of them, and bring them back to the U.S. to sit for trial. That is certainly something that can happen in the future. And remember that the FBI has legal attaché, otherwise known as legat offices, in most major cities around the world where we have allies, and the FBI does do work overseas. Now, in terms of working with the CIA, the best operations are usually joint collaborations between the FBI and other intelligence services. We have problems here in the US when our different services are not talking to each other.
Okay. What for Maduro from here on? Legal complexities. Does FBI come in because now he is on American soil? And what's the future when it comes to the impact of the operation? Because it will not just be measured by what the Delta Force did by taking Maduro out, but the logical conclusion of where it goes from here on.
Yes, great questions. Your second question is right on point, and it is the most important part of this entire operation. So let's take the first question ahead of that one. Maduro will sit for trial. This will be a lengthy process. It could be a year before we reach the conclusion of his and his wife's trial. He has been indicted by a grand jury in New York State. He will sit for trial there in New York City. And that trial will progress to try to prove the points of the indictment that he was a narco-trafficker, terrorist, that he facilitated the trafficking of drugs into the United States, and a number of other counts. The Department of Justice will have to prove that case. They will use information that was collected by the FBI, intelligence services, and a very long department, DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency investigation that occurred before the original indictment was pursued. So that case will pursue. At the same time, it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Venezuela. Right now, Delcy Rodriguez, who was Nicolás Maduro's main lieutenant, is the de facto president of Venezuela. I think that is not sustainable. She is just as brutal as Nicolás Maduro. That doesn't make a lasting change in Venezuela. So what I would like to see in the near future, and I know that these are things that the U.S. has required of the Rodriguez administration there in Venezuela, is one, they have to free political prisoners. Two, they have to put into place conditions for a functioning democracy. Three, they have to plan for future elections. And four, which might be the exact goal of the United States here, they have to kick out Chinese and Russian influence in Venezuela. I think that as an effect, this will also cause hasten the collapse of Cuba, who requires a lot of support, energy, and money from Venezuela, and now might dry up without that support.
Okay. But in terms of what's happening on the ground when it comes to Venezuela, it's Delcy Rodriguez. But President Trump himself posted or put out a social media post calling himself the acting president. Are you looking at more prolonged presence of America or Americans in Venezuela?
Yes, I suspect that part of the reason that there is a blockade is to prevent drugs from moving toward the US, Europe, and the UK, and also to prevent oil from being shipped from Venezuela anywhere other than where the US says it can be shipped. So controlling oil leaving Venezuela allows the US to control the economy of Venezuela, which gives them a soft control on the Rodriguez administration. In other words, if you don't play ball with us, you will have no money and you can't do anything you want to do. That is, in a way, using what I call a carrot or a stick. In other words, the US says, we will use the soft approach as long as you listen to us and do what we say. But if you don't, then we're going to use the stick. Our military still surrounds you, and we could land boots on Venezuela's soil at any time. I think that would not be a good resolution or a next step here. I would much rather see a negotiation that leads to duly elected government in Venezuela, where the people have their say on who their next leader is going to be. And I think that the Venezuelan people deserve that.
Okay, speaking of next leaders, let's shift focus to Iran a bit, and then we'll talk about your own personal experience. But Iran, Eric, how do you see and what's your reading on what's happening on the ground? Have you been following things? A lot of accusation on foreign meddling, particularly American meddling, and Mossad interference and penetration in Iran.
Yes, we've long known, I mean, the world has long known that the people of Iran are very unhappy with their leadership. It is a brutal, dictatorial, authoritarian regime that has caused most of the unrest in the Middle East. If there was a revolution from within and the people overthrew the current regime in Iran, that would be a good thing for the world. If Iran moved closer to a democracy that was led by the people's wishes, that would be a good thing for the world and a very good thing for democratizing the Middle East and reducing a lot of the war. Iran is currently, the regime there is currently a supporter of terrorism across the world. And also, near and dear to my heart, a supporter of cyber attacks across the world, particularly critical infrastructure attacks. So any dismantling that regime from within would be a good thing. I can't speak to whether there are intelligence operations that are assisting the widespread protests and unrest in Iran. I would suspect that there are some here and there. But any movement toward the overthrow of that regime, I think, is a good thing for the world.
Okay, as a former intel operative, share with us your insights on whether if you've had a frustrating moment where you would have wanted the administration to do something about something and did not happen, whereas you're seeing Trump administration do that?
Well, certainly, working undercover or working for the FBI means that you do what you're tasked to do. And there are times where you might want to, without getting into specifics, of course, because most of this was classified, pursue a particular target where it's hands off for one reason or not. That is based on policy when you see a need to go after that target. Here, it is good to see that the United States is taking more direct action in the world. I would be hesitant if we became too much of the world police. I think that's a bad thing for the US. But to take direct action, for example, in Venezuela, to protect the Western Hemisphere from Russia and Chinese influence, I think that denying Iran their nuclear weapons program was very good for the world. You don't want a regime like that to have their hands on nuclear weapons. And I think that any further use of military to affect change must be very well thought out, cautious, and targeted. But I don't think that should be taken off the board as a tool for the administration.
You worked on the Hanssen project as an intelligence operative working undercover to expose him. What were the difficult areas, moments, what, according to you, really made him do what he did, become a Russian mole?
Certainly. So just a little bit of history. Robert Hanssen was an FBI agent, in fact, a decorated supervisory special agent for the FBI for nearly 25 years. During that 25-year career in the FBI, he was Russia's top asset in the U.S. intelligence community for 22 years. So for most of his career in the FBI, he was the top Russian mole, stealing information from the United States and handing it over to Russia. This included most of the time during the Cold War, when he gave over everything from our nuclear weapons program to continuity of government and many different undercover operations and spies of ours in Russia who were either executed or pressed into hard labor. So he was a pretty bad guy. And at the very end of his career in the FBI, we learned from a former KGB intelligence officer that Hanssen was the person we've been after for all these years. And I was asked to go undercover in the most unique case the FBI had ever run in FBI headquarters to learn whether Hanssen was the spy we were after, determine how we could catch him, and then eventually catch him. And that was a very difficult job. It was incredibly frustrating because he was a master spy. He'd done this for many years. And at the very end, he was very suspicious that we were onto him. So I had to first gain his trust and then determine where the information he had that would lead us to his final drop to the Russians. I was able to do it, and we were able to catch him making that last drop to the Russians in a little park called Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, caught him red-handed, and were able to make him plead guilty so he could tell us everything he'd done so we could fix it. The win in that intelligence operation came from good groundwork to gain a source who gave up Hanssen's name, and then the undercover work that led to gaining his trust and learning the intel that would lead us to be there before him when he made that final drop.
Okay, my final question to you. You're seeing how the FBI is being run right now. Are you happy with it? Do you think it requires changes? Any advice to the Trump
I think that here's my advice. Let me just answer this last question with my advice to the FBI. Stay out of politics. Anytime, in my career and any time during the FBI's history that the FBI gets into politics, it gets into trouble. The FBI is best when it is pursuing investigations. That's what the FBI is, a group of investigators. And when the FBI is investigating, it is the best at what it does. Investigations that purely look at facts and follow wherever the facts lead are pure. Investigations that are informed by politics tend to be corrupted. You can have institutional or informed bias that brings you to a conclusion that doesn't always match up with the facts. So my advice to the FBI has always been the same. Be investigators, follow the facts where they lead, no matter what the outcome is, and stick to the facts. That's the best thing the FBI can do.
Well, that's a great advice. Stay out of politics. Eric O'Neill, thank you so much for joining us here on the network.
Greta, it was my pleasure, and I hope you'll bring me back on.